First of all, to all the people who came out, thank you for coming. It's not obvious, it seems, in post-COVID times to fill a room, but it's good to see people dedicated to take time out of their lunch breaks to join us for a conversation. So we're sure to have that. This event on the, well, what is it? A post-mortem on the European Political Community conference or forum, which took place in its first edition last Thursday, provides us with an opportunity to discuss issues of, well, wider European and geopolitical nature. Zach will introduce that in a second. I would just like to still say that this event is being organized in the framework of the so-called joint project, not the proverbial cigar, but the project whose acronym is joint, for the joined-up approach to EU external action in all of its policy areas. A Horizon 2020 project, which is led by EI, in which CEPS plays a role. With that, Zach, over to you. I'll come back when you hand me the floor for Q&A here in the room while you scan the Zoom for additional questions.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And again, my name is Zach Paik, and I'm a researcher in the EU Foreign Policy Unit here at CEPS, which is headed by Stephen Blockmans. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to CEPS this afternoon, and my apologies again for not being able to be with you in person. As was just mentioned, I unfortunately came down with COVID over the weekend, but it does give me the distinct opportunity to appear as some sort of big brother-like figure towering over the entire panel discussion for those of you who are in the room and probably seeing that right now. So that's a wonderful thing. I'm not able to see you, unfortunately, though, so I don't know if we're able to get that dealt with so that I can also interact with our panelists visually. But in any event, last week, the inaugural summit of the European Political Community in Prague brought together 44 European countries to demonstrate their commitment to multilateralism and the continent's future. However, with war still raging in Ukraine and divisions persisting even among the EPC's members, what does this European political community portend for the future of the continent's security order? Here to unpack this today, we've got four excellent panelists in no particular order. Ilke Toigur is Professor of Geopolitics of Europe at the Universidad Carlos III of Madrid, as well as a Senior Associate at CSIS in Washington, D.C. in the Europe, Russia, and Eurasia program. I should also note that she is a participant in the CEPS Mega Regions and European Security program, which I direct, and you can find out more about that project as well by going on to the CEPS project page. Tom Kazir, an old colleague of mine at the University of Kent, is Reader in International Relations at BSIS, the Brussels School of International Studies, which is part of the University of Kent. Joining us from Points Beyond in London, UK, is Charles Grant, who's the Director of the Centre for European Reform, CER. Thank you for being with us today, Charles. And last but certainly not least, staying on as a panelist as well as our very own Research Director here at CEPS, Stephen Blockmans, who also heads up the Foreign Policy and Institutions units. So Ilke, if you don't mind, I'd like to start with you in the studio. One of the central debates going into this summit was how much the EPC should be a separate intergovernmental organization, or how much it should be an extension of the European Union, rather. And I'm wondering, Ilke, in your point of view, did you see anything last week which indicates whether we got any closer to resolving that central question?
Thank you very much, Zach. Great to be here, and thank you very much to Stephen as well. In years that I have been in this room, so I'm very happy to be here in person. About the question, I think you started with me and you asked me the trickiest question of all, because I think one of the big discussions that we have around the European political community is that if it is EU-centric. And I think for me, at least for my feelings, it got a bit more EU-centric than it was before the meeting. Why do I say that? Because for me, when you look at the composition of the countries that are participating, and when you look at the forthcoming meetings that will be celebrated in Moldova, and then in Spain, and then in the United Kingdom, we see an important connection between the presidencies of the Council of the EU and at least every once a year a meeting of the European political community. Having said that, I think for answering this question properly, we need to see the institutional setup of the EPC, because how EU-centric it will be, for me at least, much depends on the
involvement of EU institutions, like if we will see any human resources or economic resources from the European Commission dedicated to any policy areas that we would like to use in the European political community. And secondly, what will be the relationship between European External Action Service and the foreign policy coordination and cooperation in the EPC? So for me, the jury is still out, to answer your question. It will mostly be defined when we know more about the institutional setup of the EPC. But my personal feeling is that now that we connected it to the Council presidencies, we made it a little bit more EU-centric.
Thanks so much, Ilke, for helping us kick this discussion off. Tom, if I could bring you into the discussion next. In your view, do you view the EPC as an attempt to get beyond an EU-centric European order? And furthermore, in your perspective, as someone who's studied Russian foreign policy for some time, is getting beyond EU centrism a prerequisite for a more stable continental security system?
Thank you very much, Zach, first of all, for the invitation, and secondly, for the question. If you would have asked this question a couple of years ago, I would have said for sure it's prerequisite. It should not be EU-centric. This is the only way forward. This is the only way to think about European security. I think since the 24th of February, we're in a totally different situation, where basically the European security order has died entirely. It has collapsed. It was already in a very deep crisis for many years, but now we have a situation where there's basically nothing left. And in that sense, I think there is little other choice, because all other channels are closed, than working something out in which the EU largely takes the lead. And I think what Macron achieved by the end of the day in Prague last week was a rather powerful symbolic show of force, yeah, because he managed to get all countries of Europe except Russia and Belarus together. And symbolically, that's quite important, in particular because it happened at the highest level. We had people like Erdogan there, which was not necessarily a given in advance, with all the challenges this may entail as well. Yeah? But the capacity to get them all together, to get in the margin of the meeting a direct meeting between Pashinyan and Aliyev, the leaders of Armenia and Azerbaijan, is quite an achievement. Yeah? And I think the main test will come probably with the second meeting of the European political community, to see whether the same enthusiasm will be there, whether it's still possible to get all together. And it will indeed be there as well with the institutional follow-up, the capacity or not to translate this willingness, this moderate enthusiasm, I would say, into some sort of an institutional framework, even if that will be very low-key.
Thanks very much, Tom. And you raise a number of important issues, which we will get into over the course of the panel. But let me turn first to Charles now to get a perspective from the UK, because we do have an interesting mishmash of countries in the inaugural EPC meeting. We've got some countries that want to develop closer relations with the European Union and even join the European Union one day. And then you've got other countries like the UK that don't necessarily want to have a closer relationship with the European Union, but they've all been brought in now to the same body. So do you see any inherent tension there? Can you have a functional organization when you've got such an interesting composition of countries, some who want a closer relationship and some who don't?
I think from a British point of view, the EPC only works if it is run on fairly intergovernmental lines. I mean, there are basically, the French officials who dreamed up the idea always had two rival ways of thinking about the EPC. There are those who are more communautaire, who wanted it to be run by the EU, so EU plus, with focusing on economic issues, and those who wanted it to be more intergovernmental. And there's a very good paper published by Bruegel, Deguerpe, and Le Grand Continent by Jean Pisani-Ferry, Daniela Schwarzer, and others, calling very much for the communautaire model with a big budget, qualified majority voting rules, commission running the secretariat, a treaty to decide what the relationship is between the non-EU countries and the EU countries and so on. Now, that's all intellectually perfectly respectable, but it just won't work for the British, I'm afraid, or the Turks. So if it is going to be a kind of EU plus run by the EU, then the British will not go again. But I think Macron listened to what Liz Truss and others said to him, and other Charles Michel did as well. So it is, as far as I can see, roughly an intergovernmental organization with von der Leyen not playing a leading role at all. I mean, Michel chaired the dinner, but von der Leyen didn't play any formal role in running it. So I think on that basis, the British can continue to take part. I mean, I think just briefly, I think it's an extremely good idea to have the British taking part. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that they would turn up. I mean, I talked to Liz Truss about it in the summer. She was very hostile to the idea. In the end, she was persuaded to go by the Ukrainians, the Turks, and Macron and Britain's friends in the Nordic and Baltic countries and the Poles. I'm glad she went. And I think the British think they got something out of it. They've got an improved relationship with France, which is quite important in itself. So nuclear cooperation, nuclear power cooperation with France, PESCO cooperation as well on defence mobility in Europe. There's a British-French summit agreed for next year, which is the first in 5 years. And I think also Britain's going to be allowed back into the North Sea Cooperation Organisation, which they were kicked out of because of Brexit. So I think from a British point of view, there were real deliverables and benefits, and Britain will be quite happily stay involved, so long as it's more intergovernmental than communautaire in the way it's organised.
Gotcha. We'll come back to the question of UK-French cooperation if there's time, but let me turn to Stephen first right now and talk about the structure of EPC meetings, because right now the plan is for the EPC to meet just twice a year. I'm wondering, in your view, if you think that's frequent enough for the organization or the body to be able to tackle the complex array of issues shaping not just foreign and security policy on the continent, of course, but the whole other array of policy areas that appear to be on the radar of the EPC.
Well, thanks, Zach. But answering the question is, posing the question is already answering it to a certain extent, of course. I mean, the issues are so vast that, you know, an afternoon of talks and a dinner in Prague are hardly going to be sufficient to solve them all. Even if you break out in sessions, as leaders have, and even if you have these modular groupings to hash out some of the dispute settlement arrangements that we've seen, or indeed bilaterals, you know, to allow Macron to make up with Liz Truss. So the issues are vast. A biannual meeting is not going to be sufficient. Obviously, if it is not properly prepared by the administrations, if it's not properly followed up by the administrations, that would require indeed an institutional structure, financial and human resources that are anathema to some of the leaders that made their way and went out of their way to make it to Prague last week. So I don't see it going in that direction. I'm very much in line with what Charles said, and I would add perhaps that the intergovernmental mode could be enriched with project level type of arrangements. Think of the not entirely successful Union for the Mediterranean, or the flanking process of the enlargement process through the Berlin process, which doesn't corral all of the member states, but sufficient of them in order to design and implement concrete projects, infrastructure projects, or else. That could provide, a concrete level of cooperation between the leaders, you know, and still keep it rather intergovernmental.
Gotcha. Let's follow up on that and turn back to Ilke for a moment, because perhaps, as Stephen was alluding to, the EPC may need to meet more often in order to become more than just a talk shop. But given the realities of policy competency, would more frequent meetings, if it were to turn into a body that had more frequent meetings, would that also not be more likely to make the EPC more of an EU-centric organization? And could it therefore not stand to undermine, at least according to some people's perspective, what some of the purpose of the EPC might be in the first place?
Actually, I think every 6 months dealing with 44 leaders is more than enough. So I think it's a good frequency to start with. I just want to comment 1 minute, Zach, if you let me, on this tension between EU-centricness and intergovernmentalism. Because at the end of the day, EPC has 27 EU member states and then 10 potential and candidate countries. So it makes it 37. So it's, at the end of the day, it has this alignment issue on the table. But it's very clear that potential and candidate countries are willing to align with the EU, but not necessarily the UK or Turkey. I think we should introduce one more concept here, and it should be coalition of the willing. So once EPC is kind of on the run, there should be setups in different policy areas where it would be possible for the ones that would like to join. So we shouldn't, I think this as an institution of 44 and they should go everywhere altogether, but rather, how can we create different platforms and different, rather flexible bodies inside this organization so that would serve the aim? So this would, a bit going back to your question, so then if we are seeing super excited country groups in this, in even unilateral formats or in smaller groups or coalition of the willing, then they may do some other meetings in the meantime between these 6 months that they are supposed to meet all together. So I think this is, I already said this in a Twitter space the other day, I think this is like a empty canvas. This is an all wide open empty canvas. And then what will come out of that, for me, first depends on the institutional setup, and then secondly, how much the countries that are participating to the project are willing to cooperate with each other in smaller groups or all together.
Understood. Thank you very much. And that's a great segue into the next question I have for Charles, which has to do with the question of dealing with Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Presumably, a body like the EPC could serve as a means of periodic foreign policy coordination against questions regarding Russia's aggression vis-a-vis Ukraine, but not necessarily foreign policy convergence, given the loose intergovernmental nature of the organization thus far, especially when you have countries like Serbia and Turkey that are members who've refused, for example, to adopt the sanctions package vis-a-vis Russia. So in your view, not necessarily from a UK perspective, but in your view, does this reduce the usefulness of the EPC as a forum at all, if it won't necessarily be able to tackle such major security order related issues such as that?
Not necessarily. I think the EPC at the moment is just a talking shop, but don't knock talking shops. Sometimes they're quite useful. And certainly just for a narrow British point of view, the British need to be in some talking shops because they don't talk to anybody at the moment. But for others too, I mean, I think it was probably quite important that the Azerbaijanis and Armenians were sort of sitting around the same table more or less for a little while. That may have been quite helpful too. I agree with Stephen that projects sort of run by the EPC or under the aegis of the EPC could be a good idea. And I agree with Ilka that having subgroups of minilateral groupings doing some things together is also fine. But I think we shouldn't forget the original purpose of the EPC, seen if I read him correctly from Macron's point of view, which is faced with Russian aggression in Ukraine, Europeans need to work more closely together on the big strategic challenges. And therefore you do, for some of the issues, the big issues, you do need to have the main countries in the room together. I mean, I think one way you could measure success of the EPC, as said to me by an official in Paris, is this. Look at Azerbaijan, Serbia, and Turkey after the EPC meeting. Are they slightly more aligned with the West vis-a-vis Russia than they were before or not? And if they are slightly more aligned, then that actually is probably suggests the EPC is having some real impact through peer group pressure. It is peer group pressure, not decision-making kind of structures. And if they don't end up at all better aligned with the West, then maybe the EPC is not achieving very much. I think that's one way of looking at it. So I don't think the EPC will lead to formal decision-making on foreign policy, but the whole point is we'll understand each other better, perhaps share our analysis better than we would otherwise do, and have some convergence of thinking. I think alignment. The initial French thinking on EPC was it should be about democratic values. And I think French thinking evolved over the summer months towards more the view that it should be about standing up to Russia, which is why Azerbaijan was invited, which nobody can claim Azerbaijan is much of a democracy, but it's hopefully with a bit of luck, it may be not too closely aligned with Russia. I think it's the geostrategic alignment that mattered most for the French in the end, and that's where we are at the moment, I think.
Gotcha, and that's a very good segue into the next question for Tom, which has to do with this question of coordination against Russia, or standing up to Russia. So Russia and Belarus, of course, were very visibly not invited to partake in this summit. I'm wondering, in your view, if the EPC can actually help to solve the dilemma of order in Europe if it becomes to be known over time, assuming that the war in Ukraine lasts for months, if not years, if it comes to be known as a platform primarily for coordination against Russia. And indeed, does there need to be a clear statement from leaders at some point that the EPC also intends to pave a road for Russia's eventual so-called return to Europe, however long that may take?
My simple answer would be no, not in the current context. It cannot play that role. It cannot be a way for Russia to return to European security order as long as this war goes on, as long as the regime is there, and as long as the foreign policy of Russia is not changing. I think we're in a situation of complete confrontation right now, where the old security order has died, and I don't think it's within the realm of the EPC to provide an alternative for this old security order. This will take time. This will require, first of all, the end of the war in Ukraine, and as I said, a very different policy on Russia's side. And in that sense, and just building on what previous speakers have said, I don't think the purpose of the European political community is to create a new alternative foreign policy, an alternative for the EU's foreign policy. It's rather an attempt at coordinating policies. It's an attempt at providing a forum where different views can be exchanged And it is in that sense particularly interesting that some countries that are not necessarily on exactly the same line as the European Union were willing to participate. Yeah? But it will never be a total replacement for the foreign policy of the EU. So I think for now it's actually serving as an instrument against Russia, symbolically showing that there is one European stance of almost all European countries against Russia. And I think that it will not form the platform or the basis for some sort of collective security system within Europe, because we will need to talk to Russia to do that, but it can only happen in very new circumstances. But also we will need the Americans on board. Yeah? If we consider that one of the key pillars of the old European security system is arms control, and these are pillars that have sort of dwindled already over the years, with almost all important arms control treaties disappearing over the last decade or so, with the exception of the New START agreement that is still in place. Well, it's very clear that this new European security order cannot be built by the Europeans alone. It will require the United States to be on board. And that, of course, is a sort of built-in modesty that goes with the establishment of European political community. It will not be able to build that security order on its own, even if one day we would have a different regime and a different policy in Moscow.
Could I just follow up with you, Tom, on something, which is that, a lot of people are indeed saying that, one of the primary goals of this inaugural meeting of the EPC was to send a message to Russia. But how much do you think Vladimir Putin is actually paying attention to this summit in Prague? Is he not just more interested in prosecuting his military goals in Ukraine right now?
Well, he will no doubt do that, as we have seen this morning with over 80 missile strikes, last time I checked, in different parts of Ukraine, again in Kiev and Lviv, and that's of course quite important. So this will not deter him, that is pretty sure. But I think it is underlining the isolation in which Russia finds itself, and that is an important signal. Maybe not more than that, but it's an important signal, not just to Russia, but also to the rest of the world. And the second part maybe matters more, that this is also a signal that is sent to the rest of the world that actually all European countries are willing to get together and take a stance against Russia, even if it doesn't lead to a coordinated foreign policy as such. And that's a sign that, with doubts increasing in different countries, including India and China, a signal that will not be missed, I think. So in that sense, I think it's symbolically important, but it will certainly not deter Putin from continuing his military action.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Let me turn back to Stephen now and raise the question of the enlargement process, because obviously one of the major concerns going into this inaugural summit was indeed whether or not the EPC was being posited, if not explicitly, then perhaps implicitly, as an alternative to enlargement. And of course, there have been attempts to assuage various aspiring countries who want to join the European Union that this indeed is not an alternative to enlargement. But my question is, if the EPC does offer new forms of cooperation that can occur alongside the enlargement process, could be complementary to the enlargement process, if over time, if those new forms of cooperation bear fruit, could there not indeed be an incentive to keep some of these countries in a halfway house and to just not mess with the thing that's working?
Well, the official statements are one thing, of course. Although we've had since the European Council of June this year, which referred to the European political community, Macron's idea, we've had different statements by the man himself, Macron, who, for his assembled ambassadors at the beginning of September, basically referred to the European political community and said, well, that's a great opportunity, and I quote, pour stopper, beautiful linguistic innovation in French, pour stopper la logique de l'élargissement infini de l'Union européenne, to stop the logic of the infinite enlargement of the European Union. That is, of course, killing off that political statement in one go, and raising fears that Ukraine, the countries of the Western Balkans, Moldova already had about the EPC becoming a parking lot for them, whilst the enlargement track would be frozen. And so we have those official statements. It will be absolutely key, of course, to keep progress on the enlargement process itself. And for that, I think, and SEPS has published a number of papers in that respect, the enlargement methodology will have to be reviewed simply because the February 2020 revised methodology has not delivered yet. Will it ever? We don't know. So the idea of a staged accession process is one that we've come up. Now, there is, of course, a possibility within the European political community to create space to complement whatever happens on the bilateral track that Ukraine and each of the Western Balkan countries, Turkey, still have to walk towards the European Union. That complementary space could support them on that track, but it could provide an alternative, platform for cooperation in a modular format within that canvas of the 44, or indeed with all of the others. And I would like to resonate a point that Charles also made, which is that for non-EU countries and their leaders, the EPC does provide, in some cases, an additional value platform, basically, for unscripted exchanges. If you're the Prime Minister of Norway, then the European Economic Area is your framework of negotiations and talk with the European Union. And so any of such meetings are, of course, heavily scripted for that, for such a person. But not only Norway, Iceland, the countries that Charles also mentioned.
Thanks very much, Stephen. And let's turn back to Ilke now and rely on your expertise on Turkish foreign policy as well, because, as was being discussed by some of the other panelists so far, there has been this discussion about whether the EPC should be more about democratic values and only bringing together democratic countries, or whether the geopolitical component is the more important one. So in your view, do you think the presence of countries like Turkey and Azerbaijan in the EPC is more likely to cause more problems than it solves?
Another very tricky question. Okay. I have, I think, various ideas about this question. First of all, if you can let me also go back to the basics, because why do we have an institutional setup like the EPC? No? For me, it has two key meanings. The first one is better organizing the relationship between the EU and the non-EU in the continent. And secondly, creating like a new space of geopolitical and geoeconomic discussions that would feed the needs of 21st century. And for me, these two aims are rather necessary, because when we look at the last years, the EU's relations with the neighbors and the other countries in the continent were not necessarily super good. No? We have years of stalled accession negotiations. We have all the failures in the European neighborhood policy. We had all these problems. So for me, even if I'm a bit suspicious about the democratic credentials of the EPC myself, I see the initiative as a positive addition. Then, of course, we can discuss everything. No, it's like, is this a repetition of the Council of Europe? Well, what would be the additional value for countries, etc., etc. For me, at least like acknowledging the EU needs the countries around. The EU needs countries beyond its borders to face the challenges of 21st century is a positive setup. Then, if you let me, I need to add something else, because the ultimate goal is policy convergence. But we don't know if that policy convergence will be alignment with the EU or co-creation, some kind of co-creation of new policies. And in that point, the democracy, rule of law, and basic rights and freedoms should be very much at the core. So if there is some kind of policy co-creation process, nothing that comes out of the EPC should undermine the EU, its policies or programs in the neighborhood. Then this is easier said than done, because this is a really, really complex puzzle to put on the table. But for me, it's a bit like these issues are kind of connected. If I can add one more point on Turkey without extending myself, I participated in a workshop on this particular question: what should be the European political community, with a very pro-European group, I should underline that. And there was excitement about this. And one part of the excitement was about, okay, the EU will finally listen to other countries and will be open to discuss the challenges in the continent altogether. And I think this is also positive from various different perspectives.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ilke. Let me turn back to Tom now with a question on the Eastern Partnership, especially with Moldova having been named the next host in 6 months' time of the next EPC summit. I'm wondering where the creation of the EPC, in your view, leaves the future of the Eastern Partnership, as the Eastern Partnership was largely based on the notion of the idea that 6 countries should, to varying degrees, pursue certain economic and political reforms in line with EU norms, EU expectations, EU regulations in exchange for certain benefits. I'm wondering if the EPC will now give at least 5 of the 6 countries in the Eastern Partnership the opportunity to become norm setters rather than norm takers the way that they have been in the past, and whether that perhaps offers a pathway to resolving some of the built-in dilemmas of that have been plaguing Europe's security order for some time.
Thanks. I think we'll see the end of the Eastern Partnership, no doubt. And I don't think that's simply the result of the European political community. That's the result of the fact that the EU gave candidate status to Ukraine, Moldova, probably in the future to Georgia. And that in general, enlargement is back on the table. Remember, the Juncker Commission was sort of putting a ban, a moratorium on enlargement. But now it is back, and it's back as a policy of the European Union. And that automatically entails the end of the Eastern Partnership, I believe, because the Eastern Partnership is all about close cooperation, but without the prospect of membership. So if you basically have three countries, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, that at some point will become members of the European Union, or at least given the prospect, then we have a rather unwilling country on board, Azerbaijan. Then we have Belarus, that is clearly out of the question. Belarus, many sanctions have been imposed upon Belarus. And then there is Armenia, that is in a tricky position where it is cooperating closely with Russia, very dependent on Russia for its security and so on, not in a position to get much closer to the European Union. So I think this basically takes away one of the major goals of the Eastern Partnership, that is to provide close forms of cooperation without membership. So I think in that sense, we may expect that the Eastern Partnership will for sure disappear. And it was interesting to see that several of the candidate member states expressed their concerns about the European political community from the very beginning. I think Moldova did it already a couple of days after Macron's original announcement back in May. They expressed their fear that this would become a sort of replacement for enlargement. And I think Macron made very clear that this is not the purpose. And I think it will not be possible in the current new geostrategic context to indeed make the European political community serve as a sort of alternative for enlargement. So I think we'll see the end of the Eastern Partnership, but as a result of the changing geostrategic map in Eastern Europe, rather than as a result of the European political community.
Stephen, can I get you to weigh in on that as well? The future of the Eastern Partnership, is this the end of the Eastern Partnership as we know it, and how this dovetails with the development of the European political community?
I think it won't die at all. It will be kept, if only by the Swedes, who were standing at the cradle of the Eastern Partnership together with the Poles more than a decade ago. They will want, under their upcoming presidency of the Council in the first half of next year, to find a new way, a new plan basically for the Eastern Partnership. I think it'll be a glorified connectivity agenda. Nothing substantially more, but that in itself is worth keeping, if only to channel some of the funds which are still available under the current MFF towards the region, and to provide also a space for opposition parties in exile to come together for a parallel to the Eastern Partnership. Is enlargement back? Yes, it was, and it still is kind of, but it might fall prey to the same stalemate that the Western Balkans are in right now if it doesn't get reformed. And so it might just be a bigger group in the waiting room getting increasingly frustrated for not moving closer to the European Union. So there is a lot of work to be done about reform of the enlargement process in and of itself.
Excellent. Two very different perspectives there, and very usefully so. Thank you to both of you. Charles, let me bring you in one last time before I pose a question to the entire panel, and then we'll move on to Q&A. Charles, if you don't mind speculating to the extent that it's possible, do you think that the UK's participation in the EPC is going to presage some form of institutionalized cooperation between the EU as a collective actor and the United Kingdom? Is the revived bilateral UK-France dialogue that we've seen that will be reviving itself next year, is that going to be a stepping stone to something else, do you think? Because this is something that is discussed to a certain extent in Brussels, right? Is whether or not it's possible to revive certain forms of institutionalized EU-UK cooperation as well.
I think so long as Liz Truss is Prime Minister, we're not going to see significant steps to institutional cooperation on foreign and defence policy between the UK and the EU, because she's strongly against that, as Boris Johnson was. Theresa May, of course, the previous Tory Prime Minister, was more in favour of it, and was definitely in favour of it, in fact. But a lot of the right-wing Eurosceptics around Liz Truss do believe that you don't need to have kind of structural links on foreign and defence policy to get good cooperation. And they point to the quite good cooperation on sanctions and Russia policy at the moment, for example. Now, I disagree with them. I think they're wrong. And I think that there is a very strong case for more regular structured links. And I think that if and when a Labour government takes office, which now looks quite likely, they would certainly favour some sort of structured links on foreign policy. So I think, although the EPC has allowed and is allowing for some rapprochement of UK-EU relations, it's more the level of mood music than structural links. Just one point, if I could add one point on enlargement, which to add to what others said a moment ago. I just came back from a conference in Turkey last weekend, and I do think there is certainly, I have heard the point of view in Paris and some other places that if Turkey could be happy with the EPC and a better customs union, we could sort of stop these silly enlargement talks from going nowhere for more than 10 years. And I think, I think some people in the French government probably do think that the EPC could be an alternative to enlargement for some countries, and possibly I've even heard it mentioned in relation to Hungary. If Hungary really finds EU membership so difficult, couldn't it be happy with being stuck in the EPC and something else? I mean, I'm not saying that's very likely at the moment. Within the French system, there are clearly two schools of thinking on the relationship between EPC and enlargement. Some see it as an alternative to enlargement. That's hence Macron's initial ambiguity in his May the 9th speech, and hence his slightly odd comments in his speech to the ambassadors in September. But others obviously think it is complementary to enlargement, which is the official French view. And I think the Baltic and Nordic countries only turned up in Prague because they were reassured that the French saw this as complementary to enlargement.
Gotcha. And just to clarify one thing, Charles, the fixed election rule, that's now gone now, right? So presumably we're going to be looking at an election in the UK that could lead to a change of government and possibly closer cooperation with the EU sooner than 2024. Is that correct?
I think the fixed election rule has not gone yet. It may well go. I don't think it's gone. I have to check that. But essentially, even it's not a very hard rule. You can have an election early, even with the fixed election rule. I think the answer to your question, Zach, is that the most likely outcome with the Labour about 30 percentage points ahead in the opinion polls. Any Tory who went for an election now would be out of their tiny minds. So they'll probably hang on till the grim end and hope that something turns up, which takes us to the winter in 2.25 years' time, which is the last time they can hold an election. Having said that, if Liz Truss's government collapses, it'd be quite hard for the Tories to justify putting in another prime minister yet again, just on the votes of a few thousand party members without the British people being consulted. So there might be some case of having an election anyway, but then it would be, I think the Tories would be slaughtered unless the opinion polls change dramatically.
Understood. Okay. Thank you very much. Let's go around the horn for one final question to all of you. The Prague summit may have signaled that the rest of Europe remains committed to multilateralism in the face of Russia's actions. But looking forward to the next summit in Moldova now, what particular signs, concrete signs, are you looking for that might reveal the EPC's contributions to enhancing security and stability in Europe? What are we keeping an eye out for, particularly 6 months down the road? Let's start with Stephen, moving on to Ilke, then Tom, and finally, Charles. I'll give you the last word before we open to the floor.
Well, I'd invest my hopes in these unilaterals which have been taking place already in the context of the Prague summit, to be continued in the next couple of weeks and months, and to potentially, reach an interim or hopefully final stage of conclusion by the time they all meet again in Moldova. Again, I would not put money on that. This is where my hopes would lie. What I fear, however, is that in the longer run, this EPC might go down the same way that Mitterrand's idea for a European confederation, or the initiative which the European Council in December of 1997 took in Luxembourg to create a European conference to combine the countries of the EU together with the Western Balkan states and gradually expanded it to Ukraine and other states. That was an initiative that died a silent death in 2001. In a way, if all goes well and the structures of the European Security Order, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, the EU, NATO prove to be more resilient than we might be able to give them credit for now, then there would be no need for the EPC. and perhaps it wouldn't be such a bad thing if it too dies a silent death.
Thank you, Stephen. On that note, on that depressing note, as it were, over to Ilke.
Well, actually, before answering this question, I want to go one step back and go back to the enlargement, if this is an alternative question, because I think the EPC would be more useful to its participants if it starts to offer some kind of sectorial transitional integration in concrete policy areas. But the more it offers to its participants in forms of coalition of the willing, the more outer layers it will create to the EU. So there lies the dilemma. So it might not necessarily become an alternative. The ones that really passionately would like to become EU members would go ahead, I think, but it will create some kind of external layers to the EU. If this is a good thing or a bad thing, this is definitely open to discussion. When I was discussing this issue earlier in the spring with colleagues from the Commission, they were telling me, I think we are very dedicated to go ahead with the enlargement with the Western Balkans and Association Trio. The time span is definitely open to discussion, but we need to find somewhere for the UK and Turkey. And that could be in the out layer of the EU called EPC or something else. This wasn't not that clear back then. So my point is that for now, what we have is a platform to exchange notes. This Prague meeting had 3 hours of all-together meetings and 3 hours of bilateral and unilateral meetings. The discussion platform it has provided, I think it was useful, not only for EU and non-EU exchanges, but even for EU exchanges, like the Spanish, Portuguese, and the French leaders decided to have a meeting on MidCat together in the Prague summit. They could have decided this in another UCO as well, but this was a concrete something concrete that came out of the meeting. So for me, until Moldova's next meeting, there will be lots of soul searching and a platform for think tanks to put ideas out there. And then the institutionalization and what kind of policy areas are going to be on the table with the risk of creating some outer layers to the EU will define the concrete contribution of the EPC, if it's not dying yet, no?
That's brilliant. Thank you. Either the Eastern Partnership is dying, the EPC is dying, everything seems to be dying. It's a very, very negative feeling we're getting around the room. Okay, Tom, over to you.
Thanks. I think the main test will be to see whether we manage again to get them all together and to agree on a common agenda. And I don't think the bar should be much higher than that. I don't think that's the expectation. I don't think the expectation is that this will already have grown into a institution that is there to stay. I think the second summit meeting will be the most important test. If they all get together and agree on an agenda, that will be a success already. But it doesn't necessarily mean much for the future. It's not necessarily predicting that we will then move into a community that is there to stay. And whether they will all get together and agree on an agenda will, I think, depend very much on the context indeed. What will be the situation in Ukraine? What will the war be over, which is extremely unlikely? And I think that's important in particular because I think one of the reasons why this has happened and why we had this consensus to get all together to take a position in one way or another, just by being together against Russia, has to do with the fact that other channels have been closed. Yeah, that the OSCE, for example, cannot fulfill the function it should play, yeah, because this is the organization that should work on collective security issues in Europe. But it can only function if the member organizations, member states, are allowing it to function, and that's impossible under the current context. So the European political community has a better chance to function as long as other channels are closed. And I think the same holds to a lesser degree possibly for Brexit. This was an opportunity for Macron to re-establish some important political context, in particular in the field of security, where close cooperation with Britain is of key importance and where some of the old mechanisms of CSDP have disappeared. This was an opportunity to get around the table and to involve London more firmly into a form of European cooperation beyond the European Union. So also this will be important. There was an announcement of a direct summit that will be held between France and the UK next year, I believe. And I think it will depend very much on that as well, and indeed on the government in power in Westminster at that point in time.
Thank you, Tom. And Charles, last word to you. What are you keeping your eyes peeled for?
Well, as I already said, I think one measure of the success will be, does it achieve a greater alignment of outlook of countries like Turkey, Serbia, and Azerbaijan towards relations with Russia? You know, hopefully the peer group pressure will have some positive impact there. Also, I think, you know, will the British stay involved? Hopefully they will do. I think they should do. Although, as you've gathered, I'm a big supporter of the EPC. The worry I have, the slight caveat about an intergovernmentalist like myself is, you know, if there's no secretariat, if it's just like the G20, how do we get follow-up? How do we get implementation? How do we get delivery? I guess the answer perhaps is, as we've heard from other panelists, you know, subgroups of countries doing things together, doing projects together. But the weakness of the intergovernmental model is delivery. And although it's not a decision-making body anyway, so there may not be very many decisions to implement, that does worry me that I think a talking shop has a certain amount of value, but it can only go so far. And I guess in the very long run, if the EPC thrives and becomes an accepted feature of the European political landscape, then the question of greater institutionalization of it will certainly come up, however much the British may not like that.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, lots of food for thought from all four of you. Very grateful to all of you for your insights. So I'm going to be coming back into the discussion, a little bit later to summarize some of the questions that are being posed via YouTube. So for those of you who are joining us virtually, please continue to pose those questions in the chat box. In the meantime, I'm going to turn things over back to our research director, Stephen Blockmans, to moderate the in-house Q&A session. And please do speak into the microphone so that those of us who are joining you virtually can hear you. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach, for moderating this panel discussion. I'm looking around the room. We have 15 minutes or so for questions and answers debate. If you do want to come in, please state your name, affiliation, and question. Anyone? Xavier, you have a roaming microphone? We'll take one here. We'll share one here. Yeah. Yep. Who would like to come in? Not all at once.
I want to start if there's nobody else. Karel Arnaud from SEPS. Thank you for this interesting debate. Very good set of speakers. One practical question. Who was inviting for this meeting? Who has set the agenda? And if it was France, if it's not more in the sense what the first two speakers responded to your second or third question, Zach, that it's related to the fact, yeah, I mean, like many fear in this town that it's a kind of a parking lot for membership.
Thanks, Karel. Anyone else would like to come in? Lady there. We'll collect a few.
Thank you. Anita Singh, European External Action Service. I've come here to look for some inspiration for my leaders. The question I would have is about the details. So there were two working round tables at which the leaders could express their opinions, what's important for them. One was on peace security, the other one on energy and economy, mobility. But what would you, as the experts, visionaries, propose? There's been a couple of papers already, including by CEPS, by CER, by EPC, European Policy Center, by Luc van de Middelaar, recently in Le Monde, by Pierre Vimont, the ex-Secretary General of EAS. So there is already a lot of ideas. What do you think would be most important? So exact details on peace and security, foreign policy ideas, or if we talk about energy, economy, what really? How does this complement the single market of the EU, but doesn't step on it? Mobility, yeah. What is really meant under these words? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Third question from the floor. Try and catch my eye.
Peter de Gooijer, today with Brunswick Group in Brussels. Many of the comments were about what you would expect the CPE to evolve into. Could you comment on the possibility that it just stays doing the same, what it has done now once? In my mind, this idea came about because of Russia in attacking Ukraine and the challenge it poses for the European security order, to which Ukraine has a simple answer, is we want to join NATO and we want to join the EU as soon as possible. Neither one are ready. neither the EU nor NATO. And in order to address properly this challenge to the European security order, we have to partner with major European countries like the UK and Turkey, which are not in the EU, and then one is not in NATO. Well, they're both in NATO, but with very different positions. And for that, the French president came up with the idea, well, at least let's get them all in the room and discuss it without being forced into the agenda setting and agenda thinking and follow-up discussions and organization and institutional relationships, et cetera, that we have in all these other institutions and organizations that we have. Let's get them in the room and let's see if we can make on certain items some progress. And actually with Azerbaijan and Armenia, he managed to do exactly that. So what about the prospect for, instead of trying to sort of throw the stick far away and say, well, that's where we have to run and create an organization, yet another one that's going to be not Council of Europe, and it's not good, but it's going to be something similar. It's not going to be OSCE, but it has to be an organization. And so why not just make it a process, see if we can muddle on a bit the way it is, because it does seem to me that what they did accomplish in these two plenary sessions and the breakout sessions was at least something. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter.
To the Council of the European Union. Two questions and one comment, if you allow me, Stephen. The first is, nobody has spoken about the European Council itself, how the European Council may approach this whole project or this new political European community, because of course the European Council has its own role concerning shaping the foreign policy of the European Union, and there might be some consequences on the reputation and the role of the European Council itself. So how do you see this? You mentioned only the External Action Service, but I think that's a little bit higher level, heads of states and governments level, and not necessarily the External Action Service. The second one is about the impact of the war. I have many sympathy what you said about this. I think that should be in the focus and how it will be developing. So I think the choice of Moldova, which is very close to what is going on, and a very poor country in many sense, to finance all these things. I mean, the budgetary impact you also have not mentioned, but this is financed at the moment by the presidency in office. So that is something which you should not forget about. And Moldova is not a member state. Moldova is just a candidate country given a couple of months ago. So this should be also not forgotten, that this is several million euros to finance all these things, to bring together such a high-level politicians. And the third comment is, I think that probably this was an idea, and that's a personal comment from my side, because the candidate country status to give Ukraine and Moldova, that was done in June in a situation when there was no strategy behind it. So probably one could not forget about that. What we really need is a strategy for the European Union, both in terms of enlargement and in terms of European neighborhood policy, a revised strategy, if you wish, in order concerning the post-war situation. So a longer way of thinking, a strategic thinking, which is, I think, missing for the time being. And in this context, this was just this pack just to launch something, because we don't know yet what we really want in short term, medium, and longer term. So how do you see this aspect? Thank you.
Thanks very much. Ilke, why don't you take a first stab and maybe combine Carol's question with the first one about the European Council by
Sure. Thank you very much. Excellent questions. About who has dealt with the invitations and the institutional steering behind this. As far as I know, the Sherpas worked very closely with the Council Secretariat and the European Council and the Czech presidency. So this was rather pushed by not the leaders themselves, but the Sherpas very much connected to the leaders. So this was already quite EU pushed in the beginning. And it is, for me, a very interesting thing to observe what will happen when Moldova is organizing this. So I assume that there will be some kind of coordination with the Council Secretariat once again, but not necessarily either. And the key question will be what will happen when the UK organizes this in a year and a half, no, more or less. And if they will be looking for some kind of an institutional cooperation on the invitees, etc. So that's definitely interesting. And I just want to go from here to the question on why it shouldn't stay the same. Because we love institutions, no, academics love institutions. We just want to throw them out in every second. But secondly, anytime that we talk about an event this big in the continental level, we come up with questions, no, who will follow up? Who will keep on the promises? Who will send the invitations? Where we will find the money so that Moldova can organize it? And all these questions are very much related to the institutional setup. It can stay as it is, and it can provide a platform to discuss European problems, and it's perfect that way. And but I'm sure in a couple of rounds of this, these questions related to Secretariat and the institutional setup will come over and over again. And connecting this to what should be on the table question, I think, again, for me, the topics, policies, money, institutions go all hand in hand. For me, anything that is beyond borders for the EU could go to the definition of European political community. No, it's like from energy, of course, it was there, securing supply chains, everything related to irregular migration, climate, etc. And of course, this will depend on the countries to choose among them. But for me, what is key here, looking from an EU perspective, is that the EU shouldn't need rather shady deals when there's an emergency next related to irregular migration or related to energy security. It is better we start thinking about all these challenges ahead, do some kind of foresight maybe exercise, and then try to put all these issues on the agenda of the EPC rather progressively than respond to crisis as much as we can.
Thanks, Silke. Charles, I suppose you have a different view altogether about either building up or boiling down the agenda.
Well, I don't have a lot to add to what's been said. I think, as far as I gather, and you guys in Brussels are probably better informed, that the agenda for last week's meeting was put together by the French and Charles Michel and the Czech presidency of the EU. And I'm told the Germans were not involved at all, which is quite interesting. And I think for future meetings of the EPC, it will be the host country and the presidency of the EU, who won't always be the same, of course. And I guess Charles Michel, who play a role. The French will need to kind of step back a bit. In terms of what they can actually usefully talk about, I do think energy is an area where they'll have to come back to talking about energy again and again, because the EU is not really big enough to talk about European energy policy, is it? Because Norway is not in the EU, a big gas supplier, an HEP supplier. UK has quite a lot of gas still and is a big offshore wind supplier. Turkey has pipelines coming through it from Azerbaijan and other countries. So I think, you know, to discuss the future of European energy, you do really need the full European continent involved, rather than just the EU member states. As to the question of does it matter if the EPC stays the same and remains a talking shop? Not at all. I think, as I said already, I think a talking shop is valuable because of the peer group pressure that will hopefully evolve from that, and because of the need for certainly some countries, at least including my own, to actually just talk more to their fellow member states or ex-member states, from the British point of view, in the EU, and to learn what's going on. I think talking is a certain value. As for the final point about the relationship between the European Council and the EPC, I'm not too worried about that. They each have their own roles to play. But of course, to the extent that accession countries want partial access to the single market before they become full members, and to the extent that they want access to EU money before they become full members, which is one of the drivers of the new enlargement policy that's been referred to, but also one of the drivers of some people, at least behind the EPC. But I think if the EPC stays mainly intergovernmental, not run by the European Commission, it won't take on that role. It'll have to be the EU itself that says to Serbia or Montenegro or whoever, look, you can have partial access to the single market if you do certain things in return. We'll give you partial access and we'll give you more money. I think it's going to be an EU function for the accession countries, not the EPC, and the EPC shouldn't kind of step on the EU's toes in that regard.
Thanks, Charles. As far as topics are concerned, energy security, that's a powerful one, of course. Security and stability, I mean, everyone keeps hammering about the initial deal struck between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanis, but I wonder if peer pressure is really going to suffice in this context. Certainly for Erdogan, giving all kinds of salvos in the direction of Greece, it's certainly not going to be the format that will constrain him in undermining security and stability in the Eastern Mediterranean. And Ukraine, where it all began, basically, got precious little to show for after the summit. It walked away with virtually nothing. Or am I wrong in this? Well, where do you see, Tom, the real topics for further discussion? And perhaps you can pick up the cost element also for Moldova in organizing the next one.
Yeah, I think the expectations were maybe not much higher in Kiev for this particular summit, because I think they expect much more from the EU's policies or from NATO's action or from what is coming from Washington, D.C. So in that sense, again, I don't think we should put the bar too high, and I agree with Charles there. Just the fact that we have a forum, if we manage to get all countries together again around the table in Moldova, that is already quite an achievement. I would even go one step further and say that maybe if we try to institutionalize too much European political community, it will not work any longer. Will Turkey still be willing to be on board, for example, if this becomes a highly institutionalized form of cooperation? Yeah, because they will feel their hands tied to a certain degree. So it may have the opposite effect. If you try to institutionalize it too much, it could be that it will no longer be acceptable for all states to participate. On what was said about Ukraine's candidate status and the lack of strategy, I gladly believe there was not much of a strategy, and I think the EU has a major challenge there indeed to come up with a strategy and to rethink the enlargement policy and strategy in general. I think what happened when candidate status was given to Ukraine was maybe a symbolic recognition of Ukraine's statehood at the point where the Kremlin was bluntly denying Ukraine's right to exist. And I think that was the first and sort of logical reaction to be very explicit about the chances of Ukraine to one day join the European Union. I think we all know that this is not going to happen anytime soon. This will be a long-term project per definition. And one last point is about Macron's geopolitical plan. We may remember that Macron gave a speech to the ambassadors a number of years ago where he had a big geopolitical plan for Europe which would involve Russia, and he was basically saying we will drive Russia into the arms of China or into isolation if we don't do that. What was interesting about the plan is that it was just an idea. It was not very specific. There was no blueprint on the table. And I think Macron may still have the same sort of geopolitical ideas now in terms of redrawing the map of Europe, but there's again no plan on the table. And I think as long as the dust has not settled in the conflict, there cannot be a plan on the table. We first have to see what happens over the next months or possibly years before we can start thinking about redrawing the geopolitical map of Europe.
Thanks very much, Tom. Zach, we've exhausted our time, but briefly back to you for anything you might have swept up online.
Sure thing. Actually, I think that we agreed that the panel will go till 2:30. So if everyone's okay just spending a few more minutes with it, that works for, hopefully that works for our audience as well. So we've just got 4 questions here in the virtual room. One is suggesting that Europe's security order might be ailing because Europeans have been lagging behind in their defense and support for Ukraine. So therefore, is the EPC idea nothing more than a distraction? And should the focus just not be on military support for Ukraine and beefing up the EU's military capabilities? There's a second question that takes a little bit more of in fact, an opposite perspective altogether, which suggests that perhaps a new peace of Westphalia is needed in Europe. Is something like that necessarily possible through the confines of the EPC? 2 more questions. One is there any possibility for third countries from outside of Europe, other like-minded countries like Japan, for example, to play a role as perhaps observer states or involved in some way in the EPC? Obviously, there's the G7 as another body, but is that something that's worth pursuing? And then finally, there's the question of agenda setting, which was already discussed in the most recent round of questions, but this it goes a little bit deeper, this question that's posed here online saying, do you see any challenges along the way to align expectations between EU and non-EU countries in terms of sharing ownership over EPC achievements. So I throw those 4 questions out there for anyone who wants to tackle them.
Do you want to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Zach. Also very interesting questions. I think I'm going to just pick the last one, the how to manage expectations between the EU and the non-EU, because for me it's quite an important question. And it's a tough one. So like because in the non-EU camp, we have a very diverse set of profiles between the candidates, potential candidates, the one that has left, the candidate that may never become a member, EFTA countries, and 2 remaining from the Eastern Partnership, Armenia and Azerbaijan. And all these countries have their particular relationship with the EU, and normally they bilaterally relate to the EU through that lens. If we over-institutionalize a new EPC, then we are also creating some kind of double tracks if we are not careful. So I think that's something that requires a grand thinking. But if we also see this from Josep Borrell's point of view, because he was kind of emotional saying that this is a day for all Europeans, not just the EU citizens, but all Europeans to contribute to the continental security. I know when I say like this, it sounds like butterflies and rainbows rather, but I think it's a good thing that if we can find a way to also kind of connect the citizens of non-EU countries to continental security and well-being, and create some kind of belonging feeling beyond the EU membership, I think that would be something positive. So just to sum up, I think if they keep on meeting, and in Moldova they manage to organize a successful event as a cooperation between a non-EU country and the EU itself, in collaboration with the presidency or the council, that would be a success. And from there onwards, we will see if the idea of continental level cooperation picks up, not only at the leadership level, but also on the citizens level.
Charles, any parting words from your side on and answers to the questions that have been posed?
Well, just a couple of very brief points. On the issue, I think one of the questions was, is the EPC a distraction from the fact that Europe should be providing more arms to Ukraine? Not really. I mean, there's plenty of other forums, including the EPC, where one can put peer group pressure on. You know, I'd like France and Germany to provide rather more than they're providing, rather more quickly than they're providing. And but you know, there's NATO, there's the EU itself, there's bilateral meetings, there's phone calls from the Americans. So I don't think it's fair to say that if you have more EPC meetings, there'll be less pressure on countries in Europe to provide arms to Ukraine. I don't think that's quite fair. The other point I'd pick up is the geographical extent of the EPC. That is a bit of a question, because I mentioned earlier energy security and said it's important to have Turkey, Norway, and the UK involved. What about Algeria? You know, and Boris Johnson himself, just before he stopped being prime minister, did say to Macron, "Look, let's invite the North Africans as well," because he's being a classicist. He was very much into the concept of Mare Nostrum, the old Roman Empire around the Mediterranean. But I think you have to draw the line somewhere, as the EU does for the enlargement process. And I think the EPC has to say, actually, this is just for Europeans. Even the Brits, who are very Eurosceptic in many ways, accept that occasionally you can have a forum where the Americans are not being in the room. Even the Brits will accept that. And I don't think there's any need to invite the Japanese or the Americans, because there are other forums where you can include them, like NATO. But I think for European strategic issues, with this partial exception of energy, which worries me a bit, I think there's some value in keeping Europeans together. I haven't forgotten the initial French idea that this is about values as well as geostrategy. And I think Europeans should be sharing certain common values. And there's a certain value in having the EPC to try and encourage greater convergence of attitudes towards democracy, human rights, and so on. I think therefore keep it European.
Tom, your last stab.
Maybe you can add something on the Peace of Westphalia idea that was launched, the idea that we would have a sort of new grand deal that would create a new security order for Europe. I think that sounds nice, of course, but I think it's entirely impossible in the current circumstances. And in particular, we also have to be very careful when we think about a new grand deal, a Treaty of Westphalia, or a new Congress of Vienna, or whatever, whether we see it in geopolitical terms, in terms of creating new balances, because then I hear some people making weird proposals in terms of sort of making concessions, even territorial concessions, to Russia, or whether this is all about a couple of principles of international law, a couple of normative principles that were at the basis of the post-Cold War order that were, for example, written down in the Paris Charter of the early 90s. Yeah? And the most important cornerstone of the European security system is that of the inviolability of borders, the fact that you do not change borders by force. Yeah? And this is a very principal matter. This is not about geopolitical balances. This is a very principal matter. Do we allow countries, stronger countries, to invade weaker countries and to try to get part of their territory, whatever the circumstances may be? And I think in that sense, a sort of grand deal is extremely difficult in the current circumstances because it could only be about geopolitical bargaining, which is the last thing we would need in Europe right now. This is about, in the longer term, reconfirming some of the very basic principles of a European security order, which, as I said at the beginning, will be extremely challenging, will take a long time, and will require the dust to settle first.
Thanks very much, Tom. Zach, with that, we've actually answered all 4 questions that were posed online. I look around the room and I see a need for fresh air and coffee. So I would suggest that we end 5 minutes prior to the official ending time. But I would be remiss not to thank you, especially Zach, for moderating the event. Despite the current illness, we hope, of course, that you feel better soon. And on behalf of everyone in the room, Charles, thank you very much for joining us online after your trip to Bodrum. Tom Kazir, all the way from Brussels, the VUB, and Ilke, all the way from Madrid. Thanks so much for coming back to SEPS. And we will track, of course, how this fuzzy idea launched by Macron on the 9th of May in the European Parliament will further develop on the way to Moldova. So keep an eye out for our publications online. Thank you very much for those present here for coming, and we hope to see you back soon. Bye-bye.